Ready to hand over the encryption keys? Elias Sinclair stood in my doorway, coffee in hand, a smirk plastered across his 33-year-old face. 3 years ago, he had been hired as a junior developer who could not debug a simple application programming interface call without searching the internet for every basic step. Today, he was declared the lead architect of Ether Neural Systems because his father, George Sinclair, was the chief executive officer. And I, the man who had built this technology from the ground up, was supposed to report to him. I looked at Elias, then looked around the office where I had worked for 16 long years. I looked at the system monitor displaying the codebase I had written, from the very first line of code to the last, 32,495,812 lines of proprietary artificial intelligence that powered a $7,200,000,000 company. Then, I smiled. I told him that I was not here to hand over anything. His smirk flickered. He asked me what I meant, his voice suddenly losing its confident edge. I told him that I was here to initiate the code extraction protocol. The color drained from his face, and he asked what that meant. I turned to my keyboard, typing a sequence that only 3 people on Earth knew existed. It was the original verification system that George Sinclair should have asked about before he decided I was expendable. The screen flashed amber. The system override was initiated. The authorization was verified under the name of Stephen Vance, the original architect. The proprietary code extraction process began running in the background. Elias dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic shattering on the hardwood floor as dark liquid splashed across his shoes. Somewhere on the top floor, George Sinclair's phone started ringing with urgent alerts that would never stop. My name is Stephen Vance. I was 54 years old when George Sinclair decided his son deserved my life's work. 16 years earlier, I was a 38-year-old machine learning researcher with a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a stack of rejected research grant applications, and a vision that the entire academic establishment called impossible. The idea was adaptive neural architecture, artificial intelligence systems that could restructure their own learning pathways in real time, mimicking the biological neuroplasticity of the human brain. Traditional artificial intelligence was static. You trained a model, deployed it to the cloud, and it remained frozen. My approach allowed the neural network to continuously evolve, adapting to fresh inputs without requiring retraining from scratch. Every senior professor I pitched dismissed my research, calling it theoretically interesting but computationally impossible. They said the hardware resources required would be astronomical, suggesting I try again in 20 years. But I did not have 20 years. I had a small garage, a server rack I had built myself from salvaged components, and enough stubborn determination to prove the entire industry wrong. For 3 long years, I coded in complete isolation. I slept 4 hours a night, survived on instant noodles, and lived in a state of obsessive focus. By the 2nd year, I had developed the core algorithm, which I named the Ether framework. It was a mathematical breakthrough that enabled dynamic neural reconfiguration with minimal computational overhead. It worked, not just in theory, but in actual execution. I demonstrated the prototype to myself at 3 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday morning, watching the neural network learn and adapt in ways that should have been impossible. I remember crying tears of pure relief, and then I went right back to writing code. By the 3rd year, I had a functional platform. It was rudimentary compared to what we have today, but it was incredibly powerful. It was the foundation for everything that would follow, the seed of a tech revolution. That was when George Sinclair appeared in my life. George was a seasoned venture capitalist who had made his fortune in enterprise software. He had heard about my work through a former colleague at the Institute who had finally recognized the magnitude of what I had built. Our first meeting was at a quiet coffee shop. George was 65 then, with silver hair, a tailored suit, and a magnetic charisma that made you feel like the center of the universe when he focused his attention on you. He told me that what I had created was extraordinary. He also told me it was completely unmarketable in its current form. I bristled, telling him the technology spoke for itself. George laughed and said, "Technology does not speak. People do." He argued that I needed someone who could translate my brilliance into a language that investors and enterprise clients could comprehend. He proposed a partnership where he would provide the business infrastructure, capital, connections, and commercial strategy, while I would provide the technological vision. We would build something neither of us could build alone. When I asked about the ownership structure, he suggested we divide the equity 50-50. He promised to stay out of my code, and I promised to stay out of his board meetings. We would remain equal partners. It sounded reasonable, perhaps too reasonable. I asked him what the catch was. George smiled and said the catch was that the venture would consume both our lives for the next decade. He asked if I was willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to change the world. I thought about my garage, the cold nights, and the 3 years of solitary obsession. I told him I had already sacrificed everything, so another decade did not scare me. We shook hands, and Ether Neural Systems was born. The first 5 years of Ether Neural Systems were exactly what George Sinclair had promised, a period of total, unforgiving consumption. We worked tireless hours to turn my raw garage prototype into a stable commercial product that could run in real time. In those early days, we raised $35 million in Series A funding from a group of venture firms who believed in George's business plan. This capital allowed us to hire our first team of 8 engineers, rent a cramped office space near the railroad tracks, and build out the Ether framework into a production-grade enterprise platform. I worked 18-hour days, writing the core systems, reviewing every single pull request, debugging complex multi-threading issues, and documenting the architecture in obsessive detail. I created technical specifications that eventually ran thousands of pages, ensuring that every design choice, from neural weight distribution to feedback loops, was meticulously recorded. George handled the business side, managing investor relations, securing our first major enterprise clients in the logistics sector, and handling the endless negotiations that would have drained my energy. These logistics clients were processing millions of transactions per day, and our system's ability to optimize routes in real time saved them substantial amounts of money. Seeing my algorithms perform in the real world, outside of laboratory simulations, was incredibly gratifying and proved that all my years of research were not in vain. The division of labor worked perfectly, and we respected each other's domain. By our 5th year, Ether Neural Systems had grown to 280 employees, generated $125 million in annual revenue, and secured multi-year contracts with major corporations who used our adaptive artificial intelligence for fraud detection and supply chain optimization. We were the technological darling of the Silicon Valley, and our growth seemed unstoppable. As the years progressed, our expansion accelerated beyond our wildest expectations. We were no longer a small startup, we were a massive enterprise. By our 10th year, we had expanded globally, establishing engineering offices in London, Singapore, and South America to support our international client base. Our annual revenue exceeded $580 million, and independent investment analysts valued our company at $3 billion. I was still writing code every single day, sitting at my desk until late at night. I did not do this because I was forced to, but because the technology was my life. We had a large engineering department of over 400 developers by then, but the core architecture remained mine. I was the only one who fully understood the mathematical underpinnings of the Ether framework, the proprietary encryption protocols that protected our clients' data, and the real-time learning algorithms that our competitors spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to replicate. Every critical transaction and every key system traced back to my original work. I felt entirely secure in my position, believing that no rational business leader would ever try to replace the architect of their core asset. But corporate greed and family pride can make people highly irrational. George Sinclair's son, Elias, joined the company during our 13th year. He was 30 years old, possessing a computer science degree that I later discovered was obtained largely through his father's significant financial donations to the university. Elias had no meaningful work experience, no demonstrated aptitude for artificial intelligence development, and no work ethic to speak of. but he carried himself with the arrogance of a chosen successor. George asked me to find him a role in product development, suggesting we let him learn the ropes. I assigned Elias to a junior position in our integration team, where he was tasked with basic software support. His performance was mediocre at best. His code was sloppy, his logic was full of security gaps, and his understanding of our neural architecture was incredibly superficial. He had the confidence of someone who had never faced failure, combined with the competence of someone who had never needed to try. I documented his performance issues, provided detailed written feedback, and attempted to mentor him toward improvement. But Elias did not want to improve. He wanted to lead. Within 6 months, he was complaining to his father about his limited role. Within 9 months, he began showing up at executive board meetings to which he had not been invited, speaking loudly about strategic direction. By the end of his first year, he was actively positioning himself as the technical successor, and George was listening to him. The announcement of my demotion came on a cold Tuesday morning without any prior warning. A company-wide email was distributed with the subject line of Leadership Evolution. The email stated that as Ether Neural Systems prepared for its next phase of global expansion, the company was restructuring its technical leadership. Elias Sinclair would assume the role of lead architect, overseeing all core platform development, while I would transition to a strategic advisory capacity, supporting Elias's vision for our technical future. I read the email 3 times, my hands trembling with a mixture of disbelief and cold anger. Strategic advisory capacity. After 16 years of building every critical system in the company, writing the very math that generated our revenue, I was being sidelined for an amateur who could not explain the basic function of a neural pathway without reading from a prepared slide. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked directly into George Sinclair's corner office without knocking. I demanded an explanation for this betrayal. George looked up, his face showing the calm, calculated neutrality of a man who had planned this confrontation months in advance. He didn't offer me a seat, and that small gesture spoke volumes about how much our partnership had degraded. George Sinclair sat back in his leather chair and told me to calm down. He claimed that this transition was a natural evolution for the company, suggesting that after 16 years in the technical trenches, I deserved to step back and let new leadership take the wheel. I laughed in his face, telling him that he was replacing me with his incompetent, unqualified son. I pointed out that Elias could not debug a simple memory leak without constant supervision, and that just the previous week, he had committed broken code that crashed our staging environment for 6 hours. George frowned, defending his son by saying Elias was still learning and that I was expected to help him. I stared at George, the realization hitting me with absolute clarity. They wanted me to train my own replacement. They wanted me to transfer my 16 years of knowledge to Elias, making him appear competent while I faded into the background. I told George that once Elias was ready, they would push me out entirely with a generous severance package and a polite press release about the founder retiring. George remained silent, which was all the confirmation I needed. I told him this was not over, but George smiled coldly and said it was indeed over, as the board of directors had already approved the restructuring that morning. He told me it was a done deal. I paused at the doorway, looking back at him, and suggested he should have read our original partnership agreement more carefully before making this move. I walked out before he could respond, leaving him in his office. That night, I went to my home safe and retrieved a document I had not looked at in 16 years. It was the original partnership agreement that George and I had signed in the coffee shop before the corporate lawyers and Wall Street investment bankers had arrived to complicate our business. Section 12 of the agreement detailed the intellectual property provisions. It stated that all proprietary code, algorithms, and technical architectures developed by either partner remain the individual intellectual property of the creating partner, licensed exclusively to the company for the duration of the partnership. Crucially, paragraph 4 of Section 12 specified that should either partner's role be materially diminished, without mutual written consent, the affected partner retained the unilateral right to revoke the license upon 90 days of written notice. The contract defined material diminution to include any reduction in title, removal from technical decision-making authority, or subordination to personnel with less seniority or expertise. I read those words repeatedly, checking the definitions. The Ether framework, the core algorithms, the entire digital foundation of our $7 billion company was legally my personal property, licensed to Ether Neural Systems. And my role had just been stripped away. The next morning, I contacted my personal attorney, Vivian Okafor. Vivian had handled my legal affairs since our Series A funding round, and she was incredibly sharp. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long moment. She asked if the original agreement was still valid, noting that we had gone through an initial public offering and multiple corporate restructurings. I told her that the agreement had never been formally superseded or voided. Vivian promised to review the corporate filings, and she called me back a few hours later. She confirmed that while the subsequent corporate entities had assumed the operating assets, the original intellectual property license had never been explicitly replaced by an outright transfer of ownership. The company had been operating under the assumption that they owned the code, but legally they were still operating under the revocable license from our original agreement. She warned me that revoking the license of a public company would trigger a massive legal battle, but she agreed that it gave us tremendous leverage. I told her I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted the leverage to take back what was mine. I had 90 days before my advisory transition officially took effect. I spent those 90 days preparing my strategy in complete silence. First, I documented every line of code that I had personally written, mapping the dependencies. The results showed that 56.4% of the entire active codebase, including all core algorithms, was my direct intellectual property. Without that code, the entire platform would cease to function. Second, I quietly spoke with key engineers and department heads who were loyal to me and frustrated by Elias's incompetence. They agreed to stand by me. Third, I set up a technical reclamation system. It was not a malicious script, but a highly sophisticated identification protocol that tagged my intellectual property, preparing it for isolation. If the license was revoked, the system would cleanly separate my code, leaving Ether Neural Systems with an empty, non-functional framework. I spent hours reviewing the code dependencies, making sure that my extraction would not leave any residue in the shared repositories. I also prepared a formal legal notification, outlining the specific breaches of contract and the material diminution of my role. I was ready to execute the plan, and my patience was absolute. I watched Elias strut around the office, pretending to understand the systems, while I silently prepared the documents that would strip the foundation from under his feet. Every day I sat in technical meetings as an advisor, letting Elias make basic mistakes, knowing that my silence was drawing him deeper into the trap he had dug for himself. I knew that when the 90-day clock expired, Elias would finally realize the true cost of trying to steal another man's life work. As the 90-day deadline approached, the operational reality of Ether Neural Systems began to decay rapidly. Elias Sinclair had been acting as the lead architect for nearly 3 months, and the engineering department was in a state of quiet rebellion. Without my hands-on guidance, the development team had suffered 2 major system outages, a critical database security vulnerability that exposed sensitive client data, and a failed product update that required an emergency manual rollback. Our stock price had dropped by 18% as institutional investors grew nervous about the sudden instability. George Sinclair was desperately looking for someone to blame for his son's failures, but the engineers refused to cover for Elias any longer. That was when Elias appeared in my office doorway, demanding that I hand over the encryption keys to our secure database architecture. It was the one critical system he could not access without my cryptographic signature. He knew that without those keys, he could not deploy the next major platform update, and his incompetence would be laid bare before the board. I looked at Elias, remembering the 3 years of hard labor in my cold garage while his father was enjoying executive lunches. I told him calmly that I was not handing over anything. Elias smirked, threatening to have me fired for insubordination. I smiled back and told him that I was initiating the identification and tagging protocol. I turned to my terminal and entered the final command sequence. The system took exactly 37 seconds to scan and tag my intellectual property. The monitor displayed the results in bright amber letters. 32,495,812 lines of proprietary code identified, representing 56.4% of the total codebase and 100% of the core engine. Elias stared at the screen, his face turning pale. He demanded to know what those numbers represented. I explained that he was looking at the proprietary technology that built this company, and that under Section 12 of the original agreement, I was revoking the operating license due to the material diminution of my role. I told him that without this code, Ether Neural Systems would become a collection of empty database tables by the end of the week. I instructed him to go find his father immediately. George Sinclair arrived in my office 11 minutes later, his face flushed and his breath short. He demanded to know what kind of game I was playing, accusing me of trying to destroy the company. I handed him a copy of our original coffee shop contract, pointing to Section 12. I explained that his decision to demote me and promote Elias was not just a personal betrayal, but a severe breach of fiduciary duty. Under corporate law, George, as a director and majority shareholder, owed a duty of loyalty and good faith to the founders. By attempting to expropriate my intellectual property for the benefit of his son, he had committed a material breach that rendered the board's restructuring resolution void ab initio. I told him that the board had voted on false information, believing the company owned the core technology. I explained that Vivian Okafor was already filing the paperwork with the federal court to enforce the license revocation. George looked at the screen, then looked at Elias, who was standing silently in the corner. George asked if I was really willing to burn down a $7 billion company. I told him that I had built this company from nothing, and I would gladly watch it dissolve before I allowed him to steal it for his unqualified child. George tried to negotiate, pacing around my office, his hands waving in the air. He tried to offer me a consulting fee of $300,000 per year, along with stock options that would vest immediately. He claimed that this would give me the financial security I wanted without the stress of daily operations. I laughed at his offer. I told him that I did not care about a consulting fee or his stock options. I cared about the technology I had spent 16 years of my life building, and I would not allow it to be managed by someone who did not understand its basic principles. I told him that his offer was an insult, and that it only proved how out of touch he was with the reality of our company. He tried to argue that I was being emotional, but I corrected him. This was not emotional. It was a cold, calculated business decision based on the legal contract we had both signed. I told him that he had made his choice when he sent that company-wide email, and now he had to face the consequences. I gave him my terms, handing him a folder containing a new corporate restructuring agreement. The document demanded that I be appointed executive chairman and chief technology officer with 55.8% of the voting shares, giving me absolute control of the company's direction. George's share would be reduced to 12.2%, and Elias would be demoted back to an entry-level programming position under strict supervision. George read the document, his hands shaking. He argued that the board of directors would never agree to such demands. I told him the board would agree to anything that prevented the company's stock from dropping to zero tomorrow morning. I gave him 24 hours to make his decision, advising him to consult with our corporate lawyers before refusing. I watched him walk out, his shoulders slumped, the weight of 16 years of partnership crashing down on him in a single afternoon. The board of directors approved my restructuring terms in exactly 11 hours. Vivian Okafor had presented the board's legal counsel with our original partnership agreement and the evidence of George Sinclair's breach of fiduciary duty. The corporate lawyers representing the board members spent hours analyzing our contract. They quickly realized that my legal position was bulletproof. If they attempted to fight the license revocation, I would file for a temporary restraining order that would force Ether Neural Systems to immediately disable all features powered by the Ether framework. This would cause a total platform outage for all our enterprise clients, leading to catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits against us, along with massive shareholder class action suits that would wipe out the board members' personal fortunes. The company's general counsel had to explain these harsh realities to the board, telling them that George Sinclair's actions had exposed the entire corporation to ruin. When the board realized that George had lied to them about owning the code, they were furious. They knew that their only chance of survival was to accept my terms immediately, without any modifications. Confronted with the absolute reality that 56.4% of their core code could be legally pulled from their servers, the board realized they had no choice. They voted unanimously to strip George of his executive authority and grant me control. The transition on the day of the restructuring was quiet and solemn. George Sinclair arrived early in the morning to pack his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. I watched from my office window as he walked across the parking lot, carrying his things, a broken man who had lost the empire he tried to steal. The silence in the executive hallway was a stark contrast to the celebration in the engineering department. The formal restructuring was announced 4 weeks later. The public announcement stated that I was assuming the role of executive chairman and chief technology officer with a majority ownership stake of 55.8%, while George Sinclair was transitioning to a non-executive advisory role with a minority stake of 12.2%. Elias Sinclair was quietly reassigned to a junior developer role within our training program. The industry reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Tech analysts praised the return of the original founder, and our stock price surged by 14% on the day of the announcement. The engineers celebrated, relieved to have real technical leadership back at the helm. At our first town hall meeting following the restructuring, all 450 engineers gathered in the main auditorium. I stood before them, looking at the faces of the people who had actually built Ether neural systems. I announced that the era of corporate red tape and nepotism was officially over. I promised them that from that day forward, promotions would be based entirely on technical merit and that we would return to our roots of engineering excellence. The auditorium erupted into a standing ovation, a thunderous roar of approval that proved they were ready for this change. I knew then that we had not just saved the company, but we had restored its soul. 24 months have passed since that confrontation, and Ether Neural Systems is stronger than it has ever been. Under my leadership, our annual revenue has grown by 46%, and we have expanded our adaptive artificial intelligence into medical diagnostics and renewable energy systems. We filed 58 new patents, securing our technological moat for the next decade. I promoted several talented senior engineers to key leadership roles, individuals who had been ignored during George's tenure. Elias remains with the company. He was placed under the direct supervision of Walter, a strict veteran engineer who tolerated no excuses. Walter made Elias rewrite his sloppy code, write exhaustive unit tests, and handle late-night server deployments. Elias had to check in his code changes every day, and Walter would review every line, pointing out errors and making Elias rewrite them until they met our strict standards. Elias had to work late hours, debug server issues on weekends, and participate in peer reviews, where his work was scrutinized by junior developers. This experience was difficult for him, but it was exactly what he needed. Over the course of the 2 years, Elias grew from a spoiled heir into a hard-working member of our technical team. He completed the training program and has slowly earned a legitimate junior architect position. He is not a genius, but he has become a competent programmer, and more importantly, he has learned humility. We even had coffee recently, and he apologized for his past arrogance, admitting he had expected to inherit a legacy he had not earned. I accepted his apology, telling him to keep working hard under Walter's guidance. George Sinclair resigned from his advisory role 9 months ago and has retired from public life. We do not speak, and I suspect we never will. Some betrayals cut too deep to be repaired by time. In my office, I have framed a screenshot of the system monitor from the day of the confrontation, showing the 32 million lines of code tagged for extraction. It serves as a permanent reminder that the architecture always belongs to the architect. You can buy marketing, You can hire managers, and you can build fancy offices, but you cannot replace the mind that created the foundation. George Sinclair forgot that basic truth, and it cost him his empire. I will never let anyone forget it again. Building something extraordinary requires sacrifice, years of your life, pieces of your soul, and the willingness to persist when nobody believes. That sacrifice deserves protection, and I was happy to prove that the builder will always protect his creation. If you are a creator who has watched your work get handed to someone else's son, remember this story. The code belongs to the developer, and the architecture belongs to the architect. Always.